Greetings, Upstanders. Dr. O here, and I recently saw a video of the incredible Tiffany Cross on CNN's Abby's show of Abby Phillip, and she was talking about people getting put into concentration, what she defined as concentration camps, into as people who are being picked up by these ICE raids. And the person next to her just immediately went into, I don't think it's right. I don't think it's sensitive to invoke the Holocaust and Nazi Germany and so on and so forth. And then Tiffany Cross said, this is exactly the opportunity, the moment to do that. And then the woman expectedly immediately went to, well, I don't see people being put in gas ovens and that type of stuff. And it's very frustrating to continually watch people make it so that the Holocaust and Hitler can't be invoked in any way, shape, or form in talking about Trump and his administration. And there have been people who think about the Holocaust immediately go to the death camps and the gas chambers and the people being buried alive and all of that. They immediately go to the most extreme aspect of Nazi Germany, which was extreme, which was vile, which was despicable, all of the things. And then people will say, and Hitler has this unique place in, I'm about to read some quotations, has a unique place in history. And, it's like Voldemort, cannot be mentioned, cannot be invoked. And that's utter nonsense for anybody who was interested in social justice and anybody who's interested in learning the lessons from history. The Jewish people I know who say never again don't just mean never again for Jewish people. They mean never again for anybody. Now, I know there are some who say never again and they only specifically mean it for their community in Israel, so on and so forth. But the Jewish activists and scholars that I know and read mean let's stop this from happening anywhere. And my next book is called Trigger Words, and it looks at how people use language to keep people divided. The isolation that people make towards the Holocaust on many levels is not accurate. For example, concentration camps exist everywhere and have always existed before and after the Holocaust. If I look up dictionary.com's definition of concentration camp, a place where large numbers of people, especially, but I'm saying not only, it says especially political prisoners or members of persecuted minorities are deliberately imprisoned in a relatively small area with inadequate facilities, sometimes to provide forced labor or to await mass execution, meaning that those things don't always necessarily have to happen, but they can. And it says the term is most strongly associated with the several hundred camps established by Nazis in Germany and occupied it in Europe 1933 to 1945. Of course, and not only, we can talk about how also happened during World War II. What people mistakenly called, and I learned this from George Takei, who was in these camps, the great actor, Star Trek and all of that, right? Who talked about the fact that he was in these camps in the 40s, and he said, don't call them Japanese internment camps. Because when you say Japanese internment camps, it makes it seem like these were things that happened where? In Japan. But he says our language should be American internment camps for Japanese Americans. That's a whole different conversation. Those were also concentration camps. And given the definition I just gave of what a concentration camp is, how can somebody literally say with a straight face that that's not what's happening to people who are being picked up in these ICE raids? I'll give you another one. Hitler had his brown shirts. His people who are going out on the streets, abducting people, intimidating people, getting rid of people, disappearing people for their political views. How is it not fair to compare that with these unidentified agents who supposedly work for ICE, who are all blacked up, coming in unmarked cars, as opposed to an actual ICE agent showing up with no mask, a warrant, a licensed vehicle, etc., etc.? How can we not? How is it wrong or disrespectful to what happened in Nazi Germany to pull that up and say that this is an example of that. Especially for a man like Trump, who touts his German ancestry, whose father or grandfather was involved in Nazi activities in the United States, who, according to one of his former wives, slept with Mein Kampf next to him and has a racist agenda. How do we not do that? How do we not do that? Hitler also won with a third of the vote. So did Trump, right? People also did not take Hitler seriously until it was too late. And so, do we have to wait for the gas ovens in these camps? I don't understand that. Pritzker, J.D. Pritzker, who is Jewish, governor of Illinois, I so appreciated him for actually bringing this up. He said, I quote, "It took the Nazis 1 month, 3 weeks, 2 days, 8 hours, and 40 minutes to dismantle a constitutional republic." And he said the seed that grew into a dictatorship in Europe a lifetime ago didn't arrive overnight. It started with everyday Germans mad about inflation and looking for someone to blame. His ancestors fled religious persecution in Ukraine in the late 1800s, and he said they didn't invoke the specter of Nazi lightly, is what he said. He says, "I'm watching with a foreboding dread what is happening in our country right now." He said that authoritarian playbook is laid bare here. They point to a group of people who don't look like you and tell you to blame them for your problems. I just have one question. What comes next? Why is this something that we should not be allowed to discuss? To discuss. I'm sorry, it's disgusting, but to discuss. Al Gore said in April, he said that the Trump administration was trying to create, well, let me go to the beginning. The Trump administration was trying to create their own preferred version of reality to achieve their sweeping objectives similar to Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party in the 1930s and 40s. And then he said, I understand. Why would you say this? I understand very well why it is wrong to compare Adolf Hitler's Third Reich to any other movement. Why? Why? We've had Armenia, we've had Rwanda, Congo, like run down the list, Trail of Tears, like a Native American. Like, why? These are not the only genocides that have happened throughout history. It was uniquely evil, full stop. I get it. But there are important lessons from history of that emerging evil. Absolutely. Madeleine Albright warned of this, right? Let's see. Former President Obama, in a recent speech, this is from Politico.com, said he was deeply, quote, deeply concerned with a federal government that threatens universities if they don't give up students who are exercising their right to free speech, adding that the values of the U.S. under Trump have eroded. Okay? There's one more that I want to read here. It was, this is the last one I read from Gore. He said it was Jürgen Habermas' mentor, Theodor Adorno, who wrote that the first step in that nation's descent into hell, Nazi Germany, was, and I quote, "the conversion of all questions of truth into questions of power." He described how the Nazis, and I quote again, attacked the very heart of the distinction between true and false. That was in that quote of the quote the person he was quoting. And then Al Gore says the Trump administration is insisting on trying to create their own preferred version of reality. This is what has happened. This was Nazi Germany. Rather than going straight to the gas ovens and the deaths and the mass killing, talk about what led to it. Because there's nothing going on right now in this country, and from what I can study, that didn't also start in Nazi Germany before it got to where it got. And so if you want to learn from history, you teach it. If you want to learn from history, you work to understand it. But people are stealing it away from history in schools. People are saying you can't talk about Hitler, and Trump is acting like he's actually protecting Jewish people when he's actually singling them out. That's slightly a little bit different from what Hitler did, but he's singling them out in a different type of way. We teach the story about 6 million people who were killed in Nazi Germany when it's actually more like 11, 12 million, because there were about another 6 million people who weren't Jewish who were also killed. People who were gay, people who were other types of immigrants, people who had various forms of disabilities. Like, all of that story should be told. I am not Jewish, but I believe that these constant efforts to single out Jewish people as the sole group that has suffered, and the sole group that has suffered the most, and has suffered the most tragic event in the history of history, puts a bigger target on Jewish people's backs. And it makes people more willing to look at them as a group that has been favored, and may want to target them more. I do believe that. I do, and I've grown up in communities that were very anti-Semitic growing up, and looked at Jewish people and blamed them for lots of things. And so I've seen a lot of that firsthand. And as I've grown older, I would say to myself, if people actually knew how much we actually had in common with certain aspects of oppression, we could make some progress. And so what's happening now in this country with this quote unquote alligator Alcatraz, somebody else called it alligator Auschwitz, and they got targeted, right? We have to be able to draw these comparisons from history. History, as was it Mark Twain who said, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. But it rhymes. And we are seeing rhyme patterns right now. And if enough of us actually knew the history of Nazi Germany, if many of us actually knew the history of the Rwandan genocide, if we knew the history of what was happening in so many of these other places, we could see the signs. Do you know the language of genocide? Or the pre-language of genocide? Do you know when people start saying terms like vermin, and they're taking our jobs, and they're sending us their worst, and like all of that stuff is the language of is pre-genocidal language. Nobody wakes up one day and says, I want to put this particular group in a gas chamber or in an oven, or I want to burn them, or I want to burn down their community, like Rosewood. Like, that doesn't happen automatically. It takes time. And one thing Trump is, people can call him a lot of stuff. They call him an idiot. They call him a racist. They call him a homophobe. They call him all of these things, a sexist, a misogynist. But one thing Trump also is patient. He is very patient. You don't become a two-term president and come back after losing one term if you're not patient. And notice on his hat, it doesn't say 45,47. It says 45-47, because that means 45, 46, and 47 president, because he's created his own narrative that he never lost that last election. So you all look, y'all, learn the lessons. Concentration camps were here before any of us were around. They were here before the Holocaust. They're here now. They exist. It doesn't, in my opinion, it doesn't diminish Jewish people by linking this to other tragedies throughout history. As a matter of fact, it enforces our common humanity as upstanders and not bystanders. So that's my take. I would love your thoughts, but we can't confront history. We can't confront what's happening right now. As James Baldwin said, you can't understand what's happening around you if you don't understand what happened behind you. And by our inability and failure to teach about the real lessons that can come from the Holocaust and Nazi Germany and the rise of Hitler, we're making a very big mistake right now, and a mistake that people need to recognize before it's too late. What do you think? Peace.